A cup of tea, rosemary. Rosemary Fell was not exactly beautiful. No, you couldn't have called her beautiful. Pretty? Well, if you took her to pieces, but why be so cruel as to take anyone to pieces? She was young, brilliant, extremely modern, well-dressed, amazingly well-read, in the newest of the new books. And her parties were the most delicious mixture of the really important people, artists, quaint creatures, discoveries of hers. Rosemary had been married to a very rich man. He loved her so much that if Rosemary wanted to shop, she would go to Paris, as you and I would go to Bond Street. If she wanted to buy flowers, the car pulled up at that perfect shop in Regent Street, and Rosemary, inside the shop, just gazed in her dazzled, rather exotic way, and said, "I want those and those and those. Give me 4 bunches of those and that jar of roses. Yes, I'll have all the roses in the jar. No, no lilac. I hate lilac. It's got no shape." The attendant bowed and put the lilac out of sight, as though this was only too true, and lilac was dreadfully shapeless. She was followed to the car by a thin shopgirl staggering under an immense white paper armful that looked like a baby in long clothes. A wonderful box. One winter afternoon, she had been buying something in a little antique shop in Curzon Street. It was a shop she liked. For one thing, the man who kept it was ridiculously fond of serving her. He beamed whenever she came in. He clasped his hands. He was so gratified that he could scarcely speak. Flattery, of course. "You see, madam," he would explain in his low, respectful tones, "I love my things. I would rather not part with them than sell them to someone who does not appreciate them, who has not that fine feeling which is so rare." After breathing deeply, he unrolled a tiny box of blue velvet and pressed it on the glass counter with his pale fingertips. Today, it was a little box. He had been keeping it for her. He had shown it to nobody as yet. An exquisite little enamel box with a glaze so fine it looked as though it had been baked in cream. On the lid, a minute creature stood under a flowery tree, and a more minute creature still had her arms around his neck. Rosemary took her hands out of her long gloves. Yes, she liked it very much. She loved it and must have it. And turning the creamy box, opening and shutting it, she couldn't help noticing how charming her hands were against the blue velvet. The shopman may have dared to think so too, for he took a pencil, leant over the counter, and his pale, bloodless fingers crept timidly towards those rosy, flashing ones as he murmured gently, "If I may venture to point out to madam, the flowers on the little lady's bodice." Charming. Rosemary admired the flowers. But what was the price? For a moment the shopman did not seem to hear. Then a murmur reached her. £28, madam. £28. Rosemary gave no sign. She laid the little box down and buttoned her gloves again. £28. Even if one is rich. She looked vague. She stared at a plump tea kettle like a plump hen above the shopman's head, and her voice was dreamy as she answered, "Well, keep it for me, will you?" "I'll..." But the shopman had already bowed, as though keeping it for her was all any human being could ask. He would be willing, of course, to keep it for her forever. The door was shut with a click. She was outside on the step, gazing at the winter afternoon. Rain was falling, and with the rain, it seemed the dark came too, spinning down like ashes. There was a cold, bitter taste in the air, and the new lighted lamps looked sad. Sad were the lights in the houses opposite. Dimly they burned as if regretting something. People hurried by, hidden under their hateful umbrellas. Rosemary felt a strange pang. She pressed her breast. She wished she had the little box too, to cling to. Of course, the car was there. She'd only to cross the pavement, but still she waited. She ought to go home and have an extra special tea. A strange encounter. But at the very instant of thinking that, a young girl, thin, dark, and shadowy, was standing at Rosemary's elbow, and a voice like a sigh, almost like a sob, breathed, "Madam, may I speak to you for a moment?" "Speak to me?" Rosemary turned. She saw a little battered creature with enormous eyes, someone quite young, no older than herself, who clutched at her coat collar with reddened hands and shivered as though she had just come out of the water. Madame," stammered the voice, "would you let me have the price of a cup of tea?" "A cup of tea?" There was something simple and sincere in that voice. It wasn't in the least the voice of a beggar. "Then have you no money at all?" asked Rosemary. "None, madam," came the answer. How extraordinary. Rosemary peered through the dusk, and the girl gazed back at her. How more than extraordinary. Suddenly, it seemed to Rosemary such an adventure. It was like something out of a novel by Dostoevsky, this meeting in the dusk. Supposing she took the girl home? What would happen if she actually tried something she only read or watched on stage? It would be thrilling. She stepped forward and said to that person beside her, "Come home to tea with me." The girl drew back and startled. She even stopped shivering for a moment. Rosemary put out a hand and touched her arm. "I mean it," she said, smiling. She felt how simple and kind her smile was. "Why won't you? Do. Come home with me now in my car and have tea." You don't mean it, madam," said the girl, and there was pain in her voice. "But I do," cried Rosemary. "I want you to please me. Come along." The girl put her fingers to her lips, and her eyes devoured Rosemary. You're not taking me to the police station?" she stammered. "The police station?" Rosemary laughed out. "Why should I be so cruel? No, I only want to make you warm and to hear anything you want to tell me. Hungry people are easily led." The footman held the door of the car open, and a moment later they were rushing through the dusk. "There," said Rosemary. She had a feeling of triumph as she slipped her hand through the velvet strap. She could have said, "Now I've got you," as she gazed at the little captive she had netted. But of course, she meant it kindly. She was going to prove to this girl that wonderful things did happen in life, that fairy godmothers were real, that rich people had hearts, and that women were sisters. She turned impulsively, saying, "Don't be frightened. After all, why shouldn't you come back with me? We're both women. If I'm the more fortunate, you ought to expect an extraordinary guest." But happily, at that moment, for she didn't know how the sentence was going to end, the car stopped, the bell was rung, the door opened, and with a charming, protecting, almost embracing movement, Rosemary drew the other into the hall. Warmth, softness, light, and a sweet scent, all those things so familiar to her. She never even thought about them. She watched how others received them. It was fascinating. She was like the little rich girl in her nursery, with all the cupboards to open, all the boxes to unpack. Come upstairs," said Rosemary, longing to begin to be generous. "Come up to my room." She wanted to spare this poor little thing from being stared at by the servants. She decided as they mounted the stairs she would not even ring for Jean, but take off her things by herself. The great thing was to be natural. "There!" cried Rosemary again as they reached her beautiful big bedroom with the curtains drawn, the fire leaping on her wonderful lacquer furniture, her gold cushions and the blue rugs. The girl stood just inside the door. She seemed dazed, but Rosemary didn't mind that. "Come and sit down," she cried, dragging her big chair up to the fire. In this comfy chair? Come and get warm. You look so dreadfully cold." "I daren't, madam," said the girl, and she edged backwards. "Oh, please." Rosemary ran forward. "You mustn't be frightened. You mustn't, really. Sit down. When I've taken off my clothes, we shall go into the next room to have tea and be cozy. Why are you afraid?" And gently, she half pushed the thin figure into its deep cradle. But there was no answer. The girl stayed just as she had been put, with her hands by her sides and her mouth slightly open. To be quite sincere, she looked rather stupid. But Rosemary wouldn't acknowledge it. She leant over her, saying, "Won't you take off your hat? Your pretty hair is all wet, and one is so much more comfortable without a hat, isn't one?" There was a whisper that sounded like, "Very good, madam," and the crushed hat was taken off. "Let me help you off with your coat too," said Rosemary. The girl stood up, but she held onto the chair with one hand and let Rosemary pull. It was quite an effort. The other scarcely helped her at all. She seemed to stagger like a child, and the thought came and went through Rosemary's mind that if people wanted helping, they must respond a little, just a little. Otherwise it became very difficult indeed. What was she to do with the coat now? She left it on the floor, and the hat too. She was just going to take a cigarette off the mantelpiece when the girl said quickly, but so lightly and strangely, "I'm very sorry, madam, but I'm going to faint. I shall go off, madam, if I don't have something." Good heavens, how thoughtless I am. Rosemary rushed to the bell. "Tea! Tea at once, and some brandy immediately." The maid was gone again, but the girl almost cried out, "No, I don't want brandy. I never drink brandy. It's a cup of tea that I want, madam." She burst into tears. It was a terrible and fascinating moment. Rosemary knelt beside her chair. "Don't cry, poor little thing," she said. "Don't cry." She gave the other her lace handkerchief. She really was touched beyond words. She put her arm round those thin, bird-like shoulders. Now at last, the other forgot to be shy, forgot everything except that they were both women, and gasped out, "I can't go on no longer like this. I can't bear it. I shall do away with myself. I can't bear no more." "You shan't have to. I'll look after you. Don't cry any more. Don't you see what a good thing it was that you met me? We'll have tea, and you'll tell me everything. I shall arrange something. I promise. Do stop crying. It's so exhausting. Please." The other did stop just in time for Rosemary to get up before the tea came. She had the table placed between them. She surrounded the poor little creature with everything, all the sandwiches, all the bread and butter, and every time her cup was empty, she filled it with tea, cream, and sugar. People always said sugar was so nourishing. As for herself, she didn't eat. She smoked and looked away tactfully so that the other should not be shy. The effect of that slight meal was marvelous. When the tea table was carried away, a new being, a light, frail creature with tangled hair, dark lips, deep, lighted eyes, lay back in the big chair, looking at the blaze. Rosemary lit a new cigarette. It was time to begin. "When did you have your last meal?" she asked softly. But at that moment, the door handle turned. "Rosemary, may I come in?" It was Philip. "Of course." He came in. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he said, stopped and stared. "It's quite all right," said Rosemary, smiling. "This is my friend, Miss Smith, madam," said the languid figure, who was strangely still and unafraid. "Smith," said Rosemary, "we are going to have a little talk." "Oh, yes," said Philip, and his eye caught sight of the coat and hat on the floor. He came over to the fire and turned his back to it. "It's a beastly afternoon," he said curiously, still looking at that listless figure, looking at its hands and boots, and then at Rosemary again. "Yes, isn't it?" said Rosemary enthusiastically. Philip smiled his charming smile. "As a matter of fact," said he, "I wanted you to come into the library for a moment. Would you? Will Miss Smith excuse us?" The big eyes were raised to him, but Rosemary answered for her. "Of course she will." They went out of the room together. The end of the adventure. "I say," said Philip, when they were alone. "Explain. Who is she? What does it all mean?" Rosemary, laughing, leaned against the door and said, "I picked her up in Curzon Street. She's a real pickup. She asked me for the price of a cup of tea, and I brought her home with me." "But what on earth are you going to do with her?" cried Philip. "Be nice to her," said Rosemary quickly. "Be frightfully nice to her. Look after her. I don't know how. We haven't talked yet, but show her. Treat her. Make her feel." "My darling girl," said Philip, "you're quite mad, you know. It simply can't be done." "I knew you'd say that," retorted Rosemary. "Why not? I want to. Isn't that a reason? Besides, one's always reading about these things. I decided—" "But," said Philip slowly, and he cut the end of a cigar, "she's so astonishingly pretty." "Pretty?" Rosemary was so surprised that she blushed. "Do you think so? I hadn't thought about it." "Good Lord," Philip struck a match. "She's absolutely lovely. Look again, my child. I was bowled over when I came into your room just now. However, I think you're making a big mistake. Sorry, darling, if I'm crude. But let me know if Miss Smith is going to dine with us, in time for me to look up the Milliner's Gazette." "You absurd creature," said Rosemary, and she went out of the library, but not back to her bedroom. She went to her writing room and sat down at her desk. Pretty. Absolutely lovely. Bowled over. Her heart beat like a heavy bell. She repeated, "Pretty. Lovely." She drew her checkbook, but no. Checks would be no use, of course. She opened a drawer, took out £5 notes, looked at them, put 2 back, and holding the 3 squeezed in her hand, she went back to her bedroom. Half an hour later, Philip was still in the library when Rosemary came in. "I only wanted to tell you," said she. She leaned against the door again and looked at him with her dazzled exotic gaze. "Miss Smith won't dine with us tonight." Philip put down the paper. "Oh, what's happened? Previous engagement?" Rosemary came over and sat down on his knees. "She insisted on going," said she. "So I gave the poor little thing a present of money. I couldn't keep her against her will, could I?" she added softly. Rosemary had just done her hair, darkened her eyes a little, and put on her pearls. She put up her hands and touched Philip's cheeks. "Do you like me?" said she, and her tone, sweet, husky, troubled him. "I like you awfully," he said. There was a pause. Then Rosemary said dreamily, "I saw a fascinating little box today. It cost £28. May I have it?" "You may, little wasteful one," said he. But that was not really what Rosemary wanted to say. "Philip," she whispered, "am I pretty?"